Hey everybody, Mr. Dustin here, and welcome to Bible class. You probably noticed that we're in a different place than normal, but it only seems fitting because today we're going to talk about training. So I have a few things that I think are very interesting to you that maybe will give us some insight into some of the things that Paul talks about in the Bible. So we're going to talk about physical training first, and maybe the history of how they did it back in ancient Greece. So let's look at a few things and see what we can learn. You're probably all very familiar with the Olympics. We see them every 4 years. The Summer Olympics, I think, were going to be this year, but they've been postponed. Do you know when the Olympics started? They were actually started by people in Greece, the Greeks, and they were started in 776 BC. That's a long time that the Olympics have been around. But athletes, they generally trained in a specific gymnasium for their sport, and at the time it was called a xistos, where they were frequently coached by former Olympic champions, and the vast majority of their training consisted of practicing the skills of their sport. In boxing or wrestling, neither of which really featured weight classes like they would today, much of their time was spent, sparring or grappling. In pancration, something that I learned about that I thought was actually kind of funny, it was a fighting contest in which the only rules were there was no biting or eye gouging. Kind of funny. Anyway, their time was mostly spent in sparring, but maybe in a little more gentle manner than what they would do in their actual competitions. So one of the ways that athletes stayed in condition was through their daily life. Back then, everything was done by hand. Now we have a lot of tools and machines that do stuff for us. And the amount of physical work that it took for them to accomplish their tasks, just doing that by an athlete in addition to their training, it served as an excellent off-season training program. So in the course of training, while an athlete would spend a great deal of time training their physical body, usually through body weight exercises and acrobatics and such, they also spend a lot of time training their mind. This is called a pilastra, or an ancient Greek wrestling school. It also featured a room for education where the youths were taught the Greek ideals as part of their education in their training. It wasn't just training the body. And so that grueling amount of physical labor that they had to do just to survive back in the day would really put most of our modern conditioning programs to shame. For instance, if you were a stone cutter, have you ever lifted rocks or messed with rocks? They're heavy. And if you were supposed to cut them and you were using a heavy hammer and you were using a chisel, boy, it's a lot of work to cut rocks. Those guys were known for their physical strength, and that served them very well in their grappling events. While messengers, think about the mail service that we use today. If you see the mailman, most of the time they're driving in some sort of a vehicle and they put mail in your box. Sometimes you see them walking on foot. But 2,000 years ago, they didn't have trucks. In fact, they didn't even use the horses or the animals that they had available. Instead, they ran from town to town and would deliver messages. So you can bet that the messengers were very good at the foot races. It's kind of interesting to consider the things that they did back then. But there was also, you've probably heard more about this, there was also gladiators. Gladiators are kind of an interesting group of people, and we'll talk just a little bit about them as well. Just like in today, we see football players or baseball players or basketball players, and we tend to look up to them. Well, professional athletes, gladiators, were also considered superstars in the ancient Roman world. Now, although those athletes competed in those contests like we talked about of wrestling and foot races and so forth, the most popular were the charioteers, in other words, they're riding in chariots pulled by horses, or the gladiators. So the gladiator fights were very grueling. They were professional fighters and they trained to fight to the death. But they were superstars in that Roman area. Much like you might think of professional athletes and maybe movie stars today. But there was a crucial difference. Today's stars are free to make their own decisions and do the things that they want. They had their own choices to make. But gladiators were oftentimes condemned criminals, prisoners of war, or slaves that were bought specifically for the purpose of fighting these combat sports. But sometimes free men would choose to be gladiators because they had lost their job or their fortunes, and so that was a different experience, and not as common. Sometimes women were even gladiators, and even one emperor, Commodus, he actually fought in the Colosseum, the Roman Colosseum. You've probably seen pictures of as a gladiator himself. So, King Herod, he built an arena in Jerusalem. And the Jews of Paul's day, they despised the gladiator contests. They said they were immoral and degrading. They were very popular elsewhere, but not so much in Jerusalem. So these gladiators, not popular in Jerusalem, they would oftentimes perform in what we call amphitheaters. There were these big arenas where there was what we call stadium seating, and they could see what was going on at the bottom. And they were trained in schools that they called ludi. They're similar really to army camps that we think of today. They would live in barracks while they were there, and they were only allowed to leave the school when they were appearing in contests. Though they had pretty harsh discipline, they were treated pretty well. They had skilled doctors to take care of them, and they were given beans and barley grain to help build up their muscles. They were really well taken care of as far as their overall health. However, being a gladiator was dangerous. Remember, this was a serious sport in which they fought to the death. And so even with all the special attention they got, they only fought in an average of 3 contests before they were killed. So they fought in those arenas, those amphitheaters. Again, if you want to see one, look up pictures for the Roman Colosseum. That's one of the most famous. Most of the large cities at the time actually built these amphitheaters and preferred to watch those over other athletic or dramatic events. Again, the most famous being the Roman Colosseum. Now, the gladiator contest, they really followed pretty strict rules that were enforced by referees, and they fought very hard knowing that they were fighting for their lives. A fallen gladiator really only had one chance to survive. He could appeal for mercy to the person that was running the show. If he had fought well, they might give him mercy, and they would give him the thumbs up for life. But if he had not fought well and pleased the crowd, they would give him the thumbs down for death. You've probably seen people put their thumb this way, and either they live or they died. And the winners? Well, the victors, they were heroes. They were given money, and they had a palm branch given to them. If he had had a really outstanding fight, he was presented with the most coveted prize of all. They had this laurel wreath, a crown, if you will, a diadem, that they would wear on their head. That was their victor's crown. You've probably read in your Bible from 2 Timothy 4, verse 7 and 8. Paul writes about a crown. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Thinking about gladiators, they had to go through a battle for their lives. It was not to be taken lightly. and that was the only way you could receive the crown. In many regards, in the world we live in today, we have a similar battle that we have to endure to receive that imperishable crown. We are fighting for our lives. So we're going to take a look at 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6 through 10. Let's read what Paul has to say to us, and I'm going to ask you to talk about that for a minute. So this is 1 Timothy 4, 6 through 10. If you point these things out to the brothers and sisters, you will be a good minister of Christ Jesus, nourished on the truths of the faith and of the good teaching that you have followed. Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. This is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. That is why we labor and strive, because we have put our hope in the living God, who is the Savior of all people, and especially of those who believe. So I want you to talk about these things with your family for just a minute. What did Paul say about physical training? And then, what did he say about training for godliness? And one question to follow up with that. Physical training is of some value. And we've been talking about physical training. What is the value of physical training? He says it is of some value. Well, what is the value of physical training? So I want you to talk about those things. What did he say about physical training? I think we answered that one. What did he say about training for godliness? And what is the value of physical training? And then we'll talk some more. While you do that, I'm going to get some sets. All right, welcome back. So, as I think about physical training, I think the value of physical training is in helping us learn to train ourselves for godliness. Why? Because it teaches us to have self-discipline. You can't really train for things without self-discipline. Me, Dustin, I personally like to train to be strong. This is actually a shirt that I had made. I think it's kind of cool. It's, always be on guard, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. 1 Corinthians 16:13. Anyway, I've also trained and done things like Ninja Warrior, physical training. And I bet many of you play sports or do different things like soccer or basketball, maybe baseball. Maybe you do dance or Ninja Warrior or volleyball, track and field, a bunch of different things. But it doesn't really matter what your sport is. There are principles of training that apply to all of them. So these are going to be physical training principles. And I think we'll see maybe how they might help us understand other things. First one I want to talk about is what I call progressive overload. The idea is that as you get stronger and better, you are able to do more. Lifting weights, for instance. As you get stronger, you can lift heavier weight. That's what we call progressive overload. If you are running, as you learn to run, you can run faster, or maybe you can run further, or maybe you can run further and faster. That's progressive overload. You gradually get more and more work done. A next one is increased skill level. And specifically, this relates to performing a task more accurately. And it comes with time or practice. Think about basketball, for instance. Do you practice shooting free throws? You do. And with time, the more free throws that you shoot, you get to where you can make those more consistently and more accurately because your skill level has improved. Another one, increased efficiency. Think about running again, your cardiovascular system. As you run, your body literally gets more efficient. You start wasting less energy and you stop doing things that don't actually make you move forward. Or if you're lifting weights, instead of moving the bar around crazy, you move it in a very smooth path. You only lift up against gravity. You don't waste energy. Your efficiency gets better. Another principle that we often forget is we need a coach. You need somebody to watch what you're doing so that they can help you be better at your sport. Maybe they're giving you tips about your running. Maybe they're helping you to see your form while you're doing weightlifting. Maybe they're helping you understand how to do your dance moves better if you're in ballet or something like that. You need a coach. And the fifth one, and this one's not very easy, a training partner, somebody to train with you. Let me say that a training partner, a good one, is worth their weight in gold. They're also very hard to find. That training partner will help spur you on to train even when you don't necessarily feel like training that day. The other thing is they will help keep you from injuring yourself, or perhaps training whenever you are injured and maybe you should rest instead. But ultimately, they will watch you in what you're doing, and they will help you by being honest with you to help you keep doing your exercises correctly. So those are the 5 principles: progressive overload, increased skill level, increased efficiency. You should have a coach, and you should have a training partner. So you've heard about the ancient athletes and how they train for sports. But what about you? How do you train for your sport? And that's probably something that you could think about and maybe even write some of these things down, but some possibilities that you might do to train for your sports. Maybe you lift weights, maybe you run, maybe you stretch. If you basketball or soccer, you practice dribbling basketball or with your feet in soccer. Maybe you practice batting or catching a baseball. Maybe you practice shooting the basketball or with soccer, shooting the soccer ball into the goal. Practice serving if you're doing volleyball or tennis. Maybe you practice your various dance moves if you're in ballet or what have you. You might practice on the monkey bars if you do Ninja Warrior or doing handstands. But you probably listen to your coach. So all of these things are things that we do to train physically. Paul says that is of value. So all of this is the physical stuff, but on Wednesday, I want to talk to you a little bit more about how the physical training can relate over to godly training. And that may be something that you want to talk about with your family between now and then. So, thank you for coming to Bible class. I hope that this has been interesting for you and something that maybe you haven't really thought about before. I will see you on Wednesday. I'm going to get back to my training.